Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're continuing our coverage of the 1972 World Chess Championship, the match of the century between Bobby Fischer and Spassky. We are in Game 7 today. Bobby Fischer has been on a tear. He started out with 2 losses, one of those coming from a forfeit. But since then, he's won 3 of the last 4, and the other one he did tie. So he has come back, and he's up a game going into game number 7. Now, Spassky does have the white pieces, so Spassky is going to be looking to power back here and even this series up. So we'll go ahead and get into game number 7. Starts out with pawn to e4. This was the first time Spassky started with pawn to e4. We are used to seeing it from Bobby Fischer, although he caught us by surprise in the last game. But pawn e4 from Spassky, pawn c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4 capture, knight to f6, knight c3, and then pawn a6. This is the Najdorf defense. They decided to go with the main line with bishop to g5, pawn e6, and then after f4. There's a lot of options that Bobby Fischer could go with, and he chose the poison pawn. Now, this is one of the more common lines that you'll see at the highest level nowadays, but back then, there was not nearly as much theory behind it. I do have a separate video on the poison pawn, so I'm not going to get into too much detail on that specifically. If you want to check out that opening, it is under the strategy check section on the website. But Bobby Fischer decided to go ahead and play the queen to b6, and then after queen to d2, decided to go ahead and take the poison pawn here on b2. Now, white has 2 options. He does have rook to b1, which is probably the strongest way to go ahead and attack this. He kind of went for the less common line, and that was knight to b3. Had he gone with the more common move of rook to b1, then we could see queen back here, a3, then start pushing forward on the king side of the board. And this somewhat plays like the king's gambit, getting ready to get his light square bishop involved into the game. Castle on the king side, have your rook here on the f file, just raining down terror on your opponents. But instead, he decides to go ahead and play knight to b3. The compensation really looking to get a strong attack on the king side and really take this queen out of the equation. Bobby Fischer, on the other hand, knowing that he's up a pawn of material, is going to be looking to bring his queen back here to a3, does not want to get it trapped on the queen side of the board, and then just trying to chip away and keep his advantage that he already has right now, being up a pawn. Bishop here to d3. I really think Spassky in this position should be taking here on f6. Some of the compensation he could be getting is to go ahead and give Bobby Fischer double pawns here. After pawn takes here on f6, this king is really going to be exposed for much of the game. He's not going to be castling on the king side very often, so his king's going to be staying safely back here, maybe pawn or king to e7. But for the rest of the game, Bobby Fischer has to be somewhat conservative in how he plays. He can't overextend too much because Spassky can just attack his king in the center of the board. So I really like that, but instead we see bishop to d3, getting ready to castle on the king side. Now bishop e7, I still think go ahead and capture here, although there's not going to be a double pawn here on the f-file. I still think go ahead and capture here, but decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. Pawn to h6. Still think you could take here, but decides to go ahead and bring bishop back to h4, and then knight takes on e4, taking away the second central pawn that Spassky has, and then knight takes here on e4, bishop takes on h4, and then pawn pushes forward to f5. And if you kind of look at it, Bobby Fischer is doing a really good job so far in this game. He already took the pawn here on b2, and Spassky's already given up an additional pawn. And if I kind of look at it, I don't think he has tons of compensation for those pawns that he's given up. Now, if we look at this position right here, he does have the option to be a little bit tricky and play bishop to b5. Now, this is tricky. He does actually play this a little bit later, so I think he was on his radar. I'm not sure why he didn't play it right away. But if the pawn were to take, all of a sudden the knight could take up here on d6. The king is forced to move. Let's say king e7. Then knight back here, b5, which is probably going to be done regardless of what black did with his king. But now the queen's forced to move. All of a sudden, the queen come up here to d6, check. Things get pretty interesting. The knight can come up here, c7 a little bit later. So all in all, I think this would have been a little bit better play than just playing pawn to f5. Bobby Fischer does take here on f5, and after this exchange, then Spassky decides to go ahead and play bishop here to b5. After the take here, knight up here, d6, attacking the king. And then after the king to f8, then the knight's going to come up here and take on c8. Knight here to c6, just getting this knight involved into the game, also attacking the knight. So the knight is forced to move back here. And then after rook to d8, just pinning down the knight to the queen, we do see the knight take here on a b5, saying, hey, you can go ahead and take my queen. I'll go ahead and take your queen right back. Bobby Fischer not looking to give up his queen right away, so queen back here to e7. Bobby Fischer is up in material, and he has a pretty good position, so there's no real reason to get rid of his most powerful piece on board. Queen to f4, just centralizing that queen a little bit. A pawn to g6, solidifying this pawn chain that he has, since this pawn was under attack from the queen. Pawn up here to a4, and he did have some options here. I think he could also tried g3. Bishop back here to g5, forcing the queen to move. Queen here to c4. I think this is fine as well. He was trying to just force something on the queen side of the board. So he plays pawn to a4, now bishop here, g5, queen back here, c4, as we talked about. It's these small little nuances throughout the game where it could have drastically changed how things go. So instead of having a pawn up here on g3, he is forcing a little bit on the queen side with pawn to a4. Now bishop down here, e3, check. And it's a just nice little square. It's going to be very difficult for Spassky to really force this bishop away. Later on, Bobby Fischer is going to be looking to play pawn to f4, just solidifying the pressure that he has right here. So nice little square from Bobby Fischer. King to h1, just putting in the corner of the board, and then pawn to f4 as we talked about. Nice little outpost for the bishop here on e3. Pawn to g3, trying to break that up, but pawn to g5 pretty much says, hey, I can just replace that if I need to. And you can always just get defense. I think playing rook over here to g8 is going to be very good for Bobby Fischer. Can easily get his queen involved to defend if he needs to. Rook over here to e1, and then queen to b4. And queen to b4 is kind of that just weird move to me. Bobby Fischer is definitely up in this game. I think he's dominating in some respect. I just think he has a much better position. He's up in material. He's putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. He has a nice little outpost with his bishop right here. Very, very aggressive. I think playing rook here to g8 is the best play. He wants to keep all of his very powerful pieces on board. We could see knight c3, knight e5, just starting to swing all the material onto the king side of the board. Queen to b4 just says, hey, I'm kind of tapping out here. I can't find a good line, and so I don't want to mess this up. I have a one-game advantage. I'm playing the black pieces. If I can come out here with a draw, that's fine to me. So I do think that he could have had a much better in-game if he did not play queen to b4, but decided to go ahead and give up that queen. Knight ticking here on b4, and then rook up here e2, king g7, rook or knight a5, pawn b6, just forcing the knight to move. Now it's attacking the pawn, and we do see this song and dance a little bit on the queen side of the board. Both sides kind of attacking the pawns here, but Spassky doing a nice job of using the knights together, just attacking all the available material, and then forcing the pawns up a little bit to protect the knight. So all in all, Spassky has done a good job. He failed miserably, I think, at the beginning to have any sort of compensation for the two pawns he gave up. He did battle back to be down only one pawn in material. He did get Bobby Fischer's queen off the board, and now he's even staging a little attack of his own on the queen side. Rook up here to f3, forcing the knight back. The knight comes back here, takes on c4, so gobbling up some pawns on board. Pawn takes here on f4, pawn down here at g4, rook over here at d3. So Spassky doing a good job of controlling the center of the board with his rooks. Pawn h5, just solidifying the pawn chain a little bit. Pawn to h3, just trying to break this up. Now knight over here to a5. And y'all have probably heard a knight on the rim is dim. I definitely think it holds true here. I'm not sure why Bobby Fischer decided to go ahead and play his knight over here on a5. Now, early on into the game, it's not that crazy. The knight's going to easily be able to get back into the game, but every move in the end game is very, very vital. So to play it over here, this is not the outpost you're kind of going for. Yes, he's trying to just trade off knights here, but all in all, it's just not doing too much on board. But Spassky says, yeah, we're not even going to play that game. I'm going to go and play knight here to d6, and then after the exchange here, knight on d6, rook down here, c1, king up here, g2, and then knight back here to c4. So Bobby Fischer somewhat wasted a move trying to get all cute and fancy over here, but just wasn't really that great of a move. So knight back here to c4, trying to get it back into the game. Knight up here, e8 check. King down here, g6. Pawn up here, h4. But Spassky's starting to put a lot of pressure on his opponent. As far as the strongest attack, white definitely now has a much better attack going on. Bobby Fischer, his rook over here on h8 is not anywhere close to the action. His rooks aren't playing together at all. The king is pretty safe right now compared to Bobby Fischer's king here on g6. Especially after rook up here, e6, getting ready to play. Rook takes here on f6 check, being protected by this knight right here. So the tides have turned quite a bit, and Bobby Fischer is somewhat of a pickle right now trying to get out of this. He is up in material, but as far as position-wise, he definitely does not have the best position. Rook here to c2 check, king back here g1, now king here to f5. Knight g7 check, king down here taking on f4. We do see rook to d4 check, and then knight f5 check. And then after that, we see the rook down here to e4, and Bobby Fischer is forced to do a repetitive check. He looks at it and says, yeah, I'm up 2 pawns in material, but you actually have a mating threat on board. And so Bobby Fischer said, hey, I got to draw this game out because I may lose. So after this, we did see a draw on board. So all in all, Bobby Fischer probably had the win, and he would have had a just dominant lead going up 2 games, even with the black pieces. Played the poison pawn extremely well, but all in all, was not able to turn that advantage into a victory. A lot of people always ask, how this could have continued. If there was a mistake, let's say king g1 and then rook to g8, just from a random move from Bobby Fischer that was not the repetitive check, we could have seen rook f4 check, forcing the king back here e2, and then knight down here g3 check, and then a few moves later, we could have mate on board. There's no way for Bobby Fischer to get around this. So he recognized it, went for the perpetual check, and there was a draw. So going into game 8, Bobby Fischer will be having the white pieces. He'll be looking to get back on track. He still has that 1 game advantage. So all in all, this is not that bad for Bobby Fischer. Even when he's playing not his best at the end game, he's still getting pretty good results. So game 7 is in the bag. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in game 8. Thanks for watching.